Higurashi may not maintain the same level of popularity that it had at its height, but it is still a very well-regarded series from the 2000s. And back 4 years ago, we learned that we were getting a new entry into the Higurashi franchise, supposedly a remake, rather unimaginatively called Higurashi New, that was apparently going to be a complete remake of the story. This, of course, had some people excited and some people apprehensive. The original Higurashi is very well regarded generally, and remaking it seemed a little bit questionable. But when you know that the original visual novel had a number of arcs and storylines that were not adapted into the original anime, it starts to make a little bit more sense. It's a little bit difficult to try and cram everything into a linear story. Granted, Higurashi is not exactly linear because it has time loops, but you know what I mean. Visual novel adaptations tend to cut things out in order to make the story flow more properly. So I wouldn't necessarily say I was looking forward to the remake, but I at least could see a justification for it existing, unlike another remake that Studio Passione would later on go on to do, but, we're not here to talk about that. So October comes around and the show premieres, after it had been delayed for reasons, and the first episode is seemingly just the first episode of the original anime, done again with some minor changes, some additional hints here and there towards what would presumably come, and it even ended with the original opening from the first show. It was largely following what people had expected. And then the second episode dropped, and everything got flipped on its head, because, in fact, this was not a remake. Despite it being advertised as a remake, it was not. In fact, the title wasn't even the real title. It was not Higurashi New, but Higurashi Go. Meaning that the people behind this new anime very intentionally tricked everybody into thinking it was going to be a remake, when in fact we were getting a sequel. A sequel that nobody expected. Not just because it was not what we were told we were getting, but because no one had any reason to expect a sequel for Higurashi, because the original anime had a very solid, very satisfying ending. So nobody asked for a sequel, nobody was expecting a sequel, and yet we were getting a sequel. Now, plenty of people were amused by this because it was a absolute troll. Nobody thought this was happening, and to spend all this time marketing a remake just for it to be a continuation, sure, that probably generated a good amount of hype. I do remember all the various Twitter accounts really going out of their way to advertise that, haha, we fooled you, when the second episode came out. But the disaster that Go and its continuation afterwards, Sotsu, would end up being, would make the vast majority of people wish that this had been what it had originally been advertised as. Making a sequel to a show that already had a closed ending in of itself makes no sense. Not just because nobody wants it, but because what exactly do you do? And the answer apparently was to basically go through the same arcs that had already been covered in the original anime, but change some things here and there. Play with it a little bit. Have things turn out similarly, but a little bit different. Maybe instead of this character getting killed and this character being the murderer, maybe it's flipped around. Things like that. And while to some extent there can be entertainment in that because it is something familiar being twisted a bit, so you don't exactly know what is going to be the same and what isn't, at that point I have to wonder, why aren't you just doing the remake? Why aren't you doing completely new stories instead of the same stories but just a little bit different? Like, if you want to do something a little bit different, why not go all the way with it and do something a lot more different? So while I know there were people who kind of got a kick out of Go because they got to see something familiar but not quite the same, the longer the show went on, the more it became clear they really had no idea what the heck they were doing. There was even this point where, because of some incorrect TV listings, people thought that the 24 episode count for Go was another lie and that it was actually going to keep going as another surprise. But no, it did stop, and then we got another season 3 months later, which ended up being Sotsu. Sotsu is something that nobody liked. Whereas some people had some hope with Go, some people got a kick out of it. I do not know a single person who enjoyed Sotsu. Why is that? Well, the majority of Sotsu is literally recapping the stuff that we just watched in Go, but from a different perspective. And that different perspective not only doesn't really reveal all that much that you couldn't already have guessed, but half the time it just straight up changes what you saw in Go. Now, the original Higurashi did have these question and answer arcs. Sometimes you would see an arc you had already watched, but from a different character's perspective, and that would answer a lot of the questions that you had from that first arc. But whenever they did that, they didn't lie to you about something. They didn't change something and say, oh, that thing you saw in the original version of it, yeah, that didn't actually happen. It was actually something completely different. No, they would just reveal to you, hey, what you thought had happened actually was this. But it didn't contradict what you saw, it just framed it differently from what you had expected. In Sotsu, when it goes back and tries to answer the questions from Go, it just straight up changes what happens, which is not a hallmark of good writing and not a hallmark of having planned things out in advance, which again shows they really had no idea what the heck they were doing with this. And after the majority of Sotsu basically just being that, we get to the end of it. The end of this long and unnecessary and unasked for ride. Just to have things that feel so out of left field for Higurashi that it makes absolutely no sense and is just kind of laughable. It almost gets to the point of being so bad it's entertaining. When you have characters in the thriller, time loop, horror, mystery show start acting like Dragon Ball Z characters throwing magical attacks at each other, the show may have jumped the shark at this point, or more like 3 or 4 to get here. And none of this gets into the nitty-gritty of it, which is the characters behind creating this sequel, the reasons in the universe for why this continuation has happened, for why things have changed from the happy and satisfying ending that the original show had. The things that have caused that ending to have been torn back open really do not make any sense. The character motivations behind it, the way that characters from the original series are now acting, the explanations for why they're acting that way, it doesn't make sense. If you've seen the original Higurashi, the way that, for example, the main character Rika acts, her actions that have indirectly influenced what ends up happening in Go and Sotsu, it doesn't make sense for the way her character was at the end of the original Higurashi. It just doesn't. She feels out of character. And again, for people who apparently understand Higurashi better than the original creator and better than anybody else, how can you screw up the main character of the show so easily? It not only creates a very boring experience because of just how much recapping and going through the same stuff again there is throughout Go and Sotsu, but it creates a frustrating experience because nobody wanted to see this. It doesn't do anything interesting. It becomes so far removed from what Higurashi was and is supposed to be. It has the characters act out of character, and ultimately it just ends up becoming this slog and mess that at no point ever justifies its existence. At least the remake idea had a justification. At least there was an argument for it. And if they had done that, maybe we would be talking about this more favorably, depending on what they did. Granted, it's Studio Passione, so I kind of doubt it. But at least maybe there would have been something there. But nobody wanted this. Who was this for? It certainly wasn't for fans of the original anime, because nobody wanted to see a continuation of Higurashi. We had a very, very satisfying ending at the end of Kai. And then if you wanted more of like a cherry on top epilogue, you got that in the Rei OVAs. We didn't need to see this. And there was even, a precedent for doing different Higurashi content. We had Outbreak. That was the last Higurashi content we got prior to Go and Sotsu. Outbreak is this alternate universe story where things get really batshit and a lot of things are changed. If they had done more of that, that would have been fine. So the remake idea, the original thing that they had advertised this to be, would have worked. But a sequel, it doesn't make sense for people who watch the original show because you had a satisfying ending. It doesn't make sense for visual novel fans because it's not what they wanted. They spent months thinking we're going to get a remake that's going to cover stuff in the visual novel the original show didn't, and they didn't get that. And for new viewers, I mean, my God, think about how confusing this is for new viewers. People who thought, oh, this is a remake, who maybe don't know the twist in episode 2, who still, maybe even to this day, think this is a remake and think, well, I can just watch this because it's the new version, right? I don't have to watch the original, I can watch this. Imagine somebody watching this and getting to episode 2 and being like, what is going on? Because they thought it was a remake. And then if they keep watching it, it's just going to make it harder and harder for them to watch the original because they're going to see stuff that is taken from the original but tweaked a little. So if you watch this first, you're already going to know a number of things about the original that you should not know. And it's going to take the wind out of all of those reveals if you then try and go back and watch it. Now, granted, I imagine somebody who thought this was a remake who would start to watch it and then would get to the point where it's clearly not, would eventually say, okay, I should probably stop this. But even then, you're already probably learning more than you should for somebody who hasn't experienced the story before. And it also just makes it so difficult to recommend Higurashi now. Because not only is Higurashi, if you add everything up at 100 episodes at this point, which is a lot, plenty of people are going to say, I'm not watching it, it's too long. But so much of it is stuff you have to tell people not to watch. Even before, there was a question over, should you watch the Kira OVAs because they're just non-canon comedy adventures? Should you watch Outbreak because it's its own little universe story? There was already a sense of, hey, maybe you don't tell people to just watch all of Higurashi. But now with Go and Sotsu and other like 40 episodes that are really not good and just awful to watch. It's so hard to recommend the show because you have to have so many asterisks. You have to say, well, you should watch it, but you should only watch the first 2 seasons and maybe the Rei OVAs. And if you like the non-canon comedy, maybe you watch the Kira OVAs. And maybe if you want to see a different take on things, you watch Outbreak, but definitely don't watch Go and Sotsu. I mean, the more you try to explain it to people, the more you're probably going to turn them off. But if you don't explain it, you might run the risk of them starting with Go first, and that makes it even worse. So if anything, this has made it harder for people to get into Higurashi. You know, you could argue, okay, even bad publicity is still publicity. Like the fact that there was Higurashi in 2020 and 2021 maybe would get more people to watch it. And yeah, maybe if they had all the context. But plenty of people probably didn't, and now are probably less likely to watch it because of how confusing and convoluted Go and Sotsu have made it, even ignoring the fact that they are not good seasons. So whereas this could have helped people to want to get into Higurashi, it could have made people want to go back and watch the original if they hadn't already. It could have drawn attention to it for people who have just never even heard of it. I think, if anything, it has hurt Higurashi to have these poor quality seasons that lie to you about what they are and lie to you about what's contained inside, attached to it, weighing down this great show that we already had that had a satisfying conclusion. I just can't get over the fact that somebody thought it was a good idea to make a continuation to a show that had an ending, and an ending that people liked. It just makes absolutely no sense. The good thing, I guess, is that generally people don't really acknowledge Go and Sotsu as much now, especially in the wake of Sotsu. Like, even the people who kind of liked Go generally don't really like it now because of what Sotsu ended up doing. So if people continue to forget about Go and Sotsu, but still talk about the original Higurashi, which seems to be kind of where things are going now, that's not a bad thing. Maybe at the end of the day, we can look at it and say, it brought the name of Higurashi back into prominence, and that's good enough, and people will just forget Go and Sotsu, but remember that, hey, Higurashi exists, right? That would be the best case scenario. But the fact that any of this happened to begin with, a remake that ended up being a lie, that turned into a sequel, that didn't do anything all that interesting, and ended up spending half of its time just recapping stuff it had already shown, only to go completely off the rails and bonkers by the end. I just cannot imagine what the people behind these seasons could have possibly been thinking. Unless they themselves had Hinamizawa syndrome and were just as crazed as the characters in the show, it just does not make sense. But hey, maybe in time we'll forget it ever happened, or go into another time loop where it never existed in the first place. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and until next time, take care everyone. Look forward to the next video.